As far as the fans are concerned, a new slinky, sultry, sexy siren of the silver screen. But underneath all this cheesecake, a girl of Botticellian slenderness. Blue glass, like the night blue of early silent movies. Compartments becoming individual silver screens. Strips of film as though they are stored in the back of the machine for operation. Brightly colored pinballs traveling inclined runways, compartment after compartment with a symphony of mechanical magic of sight and sound borrowed from the motion picture art into childhood in a fantasy through the streets of New York.
His portraits are recyclings. What he uses are found objects, would be too weak a term, selected, sought for, desired objects. He must have been clipping all the time. He must have been pouring through magazines and collecting things and haunting junk shops and flea markets, looking for the images that corresponded to his imagination.
If some theme or something caught his mind, he would begin making a file and adding things to that one file so that the file built up. And when he had the file, then he'd start possibly making a box out of it. His whole enterprise in his art and in his life was something I think that individually concerns every one of us, and that is preservation of memory. And so his art was an entire enterprise to hold on to culture, the cultural memory, the communal memory that constantly decays, because even in our own lives, memories change, are lost. And so this was a magnificent one-man rearguard action against the decay of culture.
Perhaps a definition of a box could be as a kind of forgotten game, a philosophical toy of the Victorian era with poetic or magical moving parts.
New York for him was a kind of practical wonderland. He loved it. I think there's no doubt about that. He loved going in there. And so the great humming, degraded matrix of Manhattan, which he called a stinking buzz of the city, if I remember properly. He would voyage into that on the subway, and then he would start seeing this active accumulation of madness, and he would take the detritus in little stores and pick up things, and so it became for him a kind of library that gave him the verbs and nouns and words, which were objects, that he then took back to Utopia Parkway and used in his work.
I woke up at 5 with the dawn breaking and the moon seen through the leaves outside the bedroom window. The streetlights hidden among the leaves gave a strong sense of the theatrical or supernatural, with the real magic of theater, but borrowed from nature. Again, that freshness of early morning, no words can express. I got down to the cellar by 5:30, feeling at one with my environment and with the quiet of the garden. Tony dropped in on his way to the airport. I was in my bathrobe. The first Cornell box I saw was in New York City on Manhattan in a gallery. It was one of his sunrise boxes. I still can't, I mean, I can describe the box to you, but the feeling I got from it, to have captured inside of a box with a glass front, the very sense of the mystery and the joy of living, is that's what he did with his boxes. You know, you can't, it's hard to verbalize it. It's not a matter of liking his work. You can't, it doesn't express itself by likes and dislikes. You know, it's intriguing, it's interesting, it's mysterious, it's provoking. You know, you find yourself looking at inanimate objects, and by their relationship and the way they're placed inside of a set form, like a box, unpenetrable, because there's a glass that keeps you from getting inside of it. There's movable objects that move at the slightest touch. There's nothing likable about it. It's, in some instances, it's compelling, that's what it is. You know, it draws your attention.
I think he's one of the great artists of the century. He's a great American artist. He's great in a particularly interesting American way, which was that he was so obsessed by Europe. He never left New York State, as far as I know. He hardly ever left the house where he lived just outside of New York City. I think he told me once that he had gone upstate New York on one trip, but he was as close to being a sort of classic example of the reclusive, eccentric bachelor artist as one could possibly imagine. And yet he had this very intense relationship to France, to Europe in general, and to France in particular. He never went to France. He didn't know French. And yet his pieces are full of the French language.
In the early 60s, I had met Charles Henry Ford, and Charles said, I'm going out to see Joseph, and would you like to come along? So he invited Andy Warhol and Bob Indiana, and I don't know, I think someone else. And we went out to this little house in Utopia Parkway, Queens, and there was Joseph standing on the lawn, and he invited us in, and he was living with his mother and his brother, who had a physical condition like a spasticity. It was a rather crowded house, and his brother was sitting at a big round table with all sorts of things that he was working on, and like, I don't know if it was artworks or I think it was trains, toy trains. And his mother served Kool-Aid and cookies.
His relationship with his brother was the key to it all, because he felt responsible for his brother, for Robert's well-being. So everything he ever did was with Robert in mind. And that's the start of it all. He made those boxes for his brother. One of the early ones he made was he took his mother's powder box and he put slivers of mirror around the inside of this powder box. Then he put a hole in the side and a hole at the top. Put a half a dozen needles stuck into the box. And he put thimbles on top of them. Imagine his brother, who'd never been out of a chair, hardly ever, sitting in that front room in this house on a foggy, very depressive day in the 30s sometime. A boy that'd never been anywhere, only listened to radio and looked through magazines and had little choo-choo trains on the wall. And his brother takes this box he made and holds it up to his eye. And he sees a thimble forest.
He had a very sentimental idea about children, and his interests went toward, for instance, the literature, which had to do with what almost a Victorian idea of innocence, little Alice in Wonderland, very much so. I think Alice in Wonderland is very much in that. Or those little girls with the nice little dresses who were always very mincing and sweet. He was sentimental about children, except when they were around. When he was actually vis-a-vis children, he was quite frightened of them.
Joseph loved children because he, I mean, it was their purity and their innocence. And he loved to get photographs. He always wanted to have photographs of people as children. I know that I sent him about a dozen of myself as a child. And I think he much preferred the child selves of people. And he asked the neighborhood children to come and help him put in a leaf or a rubber ball or something in one of his boxes. So there were always children there at the house.
He would reach out to the children of his neighborhood. They came ordinarily and took these extremely expensive boxes out of his garage. I saw once, literally, a little girl come tripping across the grass with one of these, by this time, designated priceless masterpieces, and say, "I'm tired of this one, Joseph," over the literal picket white fence, and him say, "That's all right, my dear," and he took it from her and went into this garage and came back with another, and he said, "Why don't you try this one for a while and tell me how your mummy likes it?" You really felt in the wistfulness of him that he wanted to really go traipsing after her, you know.
How can I express the intense joy of stepping out into the backyard? The supreme happiness of looking up through the branches of the quince tree, the sense of my relationship with the whole house.
I always thought of him as the center of a vast bureaucratic department in which he had files upon files upon files, and in which he had his boxes down in the basement full of the individual parts that would go into boxes. Well, we're at the Joseph Cornell Study Center at the National Museum of American Art in Washington. And all around us is all the material that was in the house. The marvelous files, categorized and labeled, and all the beginning of the whole gestation in his mind and memory of how things would be prepared for use.
I don't know if it's time, things can be done in a splash, but his method of putting memos to himself in the boxes for the adjustments over a period of time made the work deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's really a genius that's able to put layers and layers and layers of thought into something and having it seep out slowly, and so you would enjoy it for a long, long time.
Around noon, I got the familiar feeling of invitation to the water. There was also the stimulus of trying to find another piece of jetsam, or is it flotsam? I shaved and started for the water at around 3 o'clock. Either on Monday or Tuesday night, I had a dream of riding my bicycle along a gravel path in front of the house. This is a variation of the earlier repeated dreams, which seem to be of the greatest significance of traversing long stretches of country roads and landscapes. This simple experience of bicycle rides, the manner in which riding blind, a succession of paths and bypaths, would open up, releasing an unsuspected and extravagant joy of discovery. The magnificent sweep and panorama that greets the eye with the city skyline across the water, the American scene of the seascape. When you catch the tide just right, there is the inevitable company of the laughing gulls also taking advantage of the extra loot. And then, that almost unfailing sign of overwhelming surprise, a battered, jagged jar from France. May have come from the distant past, the golden age of the Romantic era. At any rate, it is superb in catching the nostalgia of the sea. On Good Friday, after taking Robert to the dentist's in the direction of the fields of Whitestone, a copy of Life is noticed in a little store carrying copious color spreads of the Van Eyck altarpiece, The Adoration of the Lamb. The spires and towers in Van Eyck's altarpiece have a parallel in seeing the spires and towers of Manhattan from these meadows on certain clear afternoons. At the time, my thoughts were strongly preoccupied with one of the supreme literary achievements of this century.
He was very much interested not only in literature, but in books as things. This is the Le Grand Monde, known in English as The Wanderer, a book about which Joseph Cornell was very tender. And it's a very tender book, which a lot of us read in our childhood. Here's a characteristic passage. Nevertheless, he went on walking in her direction with a distressing slowness. Not a roof, not a soul, not even the cry of a curlew in the reeds of the marshes. And above this complete solitude shone a December sun, clear and icy. It might have been 3 o'clock in the afternoon when he noticed at last, above a fir wood, the spire of a gray turret. He saw himself somewhat as the romantic young wanderer, and Alain Fournier suited his mood perfectly, because Alain Fournier is extremely, what would be the word, I think, oblique. There's no harsh light in Alain Fournier, and I think that's what Joseph liked about this particular book.
Who can say what priceless masterpieces of the early filmmakers have been swallowed up for good? We have a whole new crop of movies, really extra choice, delicious items.
His brother was crippled and needed entertainment. This was before TV, and Joseph used to buy films to entertain this brother who couldn't go out to the movies very easily. And then the films that he would buy out of trash barrels down on the Lower East Side, or discarded little shorts, or even Hollywood movies, would finally become boring to his brother and to Joseph as well. So he began re-editing them, editing them essentially in order to entertain his brother again with this same limited material. Thus, he stumbled along a line of his caring for his brother into the normal expectations of an art, that you make something that can be attended over and over again and or forever. And Joseph really came to that with film, trying to make that for his brother.
Well, Cornell took a quite undistinguished 1931 Hollywood jungle film called East of Borneo, which he liked because he was particularly interested in the female lead, the actress Rose Hobart. Cornell took the 1931 East of Borneo and re-edited it. That is, he dissolved the narrative sequence. He removed the logical continuity from the film. So he's created a dream work out of what was a rather banal and laughable Hollywood jungle film. Cornell had an enormous courage to do what would have been considered bad editing. He loved jump cuts, sudden disappearances. He included 1 or 2 frames of titles from silent films, sometimes upside down, sometimes backwards. It took the interest in a certain kind of deliberate fracturing that was part of the avant-garde cinema of the late 50s and early 60s to be able to appreciate how startlingly original Cornell was and to completely liberate us from the notion that this was simply inept.
I had a feeling of real accomplishment after a distressing sense of pressure with the boxes tied up and ready for town. I shaved and dressed and waved goodbye to Robert on porch, enjoying every second of the ride from the vantage point of the first car, the openness on emerging from the tunnel, the barges and waterfront activity below, the winding creek in both directions, the distant skyline of New York City, the sweep of the Bay of Naples. Activity in a brick tenement. A tenement observed almost daily for years. It was all over in a flash as the car made a lurching turn and headed towards the tunnel. 3 girls scattered about the room. The oldest, with right arm outstretched in a gesture of command. The car straightened out and went under the river. I felt the usual stimulating feeling of release and perspective on my work that comes from getting into town. I stopped in Grand Central waiting room and stood on the parapet watching the crowds below, absorbed in the coming and going of the endless flow. I had a sense of elation, looking at the celestial blue heavens and golden constellations on the ceiling, and thought of the ones now covered up. I remember from childhood, formerly of a far greater richness and execution.
Every time I spoke to him, he went on about his love of coming into Manhattan and of the mysteries of the city. He particularly liked odd, almost surreal juxtapositions that certain shops gave him. An image of the sun on a wheel of cheese next to a statuette. Around Grand Street in Lower Manhattan, there used to be a district of wedding dress shops, so that there were brides frozen, mannequins frozen in windows. And Cornell often filmed such windows as though they were collage boxes. And often he liked to have a figure, especially a young woman, wandering through these places, almost as though that person were the spirit of the place, come alive and participating in the sights.
One day he called me and he said, I'm Joseph Cornell, would you like to make a film with me? And I think I just said yes. So he picked the place and the time, which was the Union Square on a cold Saturday, December day. And we met there, and he brought 2 or 3 rolls of film, and I brought my trusty old Bolex camera.
It is a remarkable fact to do a portrait of Union Square, a large park that most people would associate with radical politics, where left-wing demonstrations occurred. Not Joseph Cornell. For Joseph Cornell, this place is the aviary, as though all of the tall buildings around it constituted the walls of an enormous outdoor bird cage, and the park was a place where various birds came to settle in the midst of the city.
In the summer of 1944, on a particularly oppressive, sultry, sunshiny day, I went to Brooklyn. Disappointed with the movies, I decided to go out to Coney Island. What an elated feeling arriving there in the evening and feeling the breezes sweep in from the ocean after the oppressive heat with their soft music. The moon seemed to belong to the glitter of Luna Park. Emotions aroused by the bareness of the beaches, completely deserted except for a few stragglers. I lingered on the boardwalk, watching the parachute jump, taking in the moonlight.
You know, the whole vernacular that Cornell was interested in, the shooting gallery, the little cranes that pick up things in these glass enclosures, the jacks, the dice, the board games, the grids, etc. All that vernacular of entertainment, all that vernacular of, in large part, childhood entertainment, I think was entirely fascinating to him, and I think the word is fascinating. We always have that intense fascination as a kid with those things. I remember returning again and again to that grab thing that, you know, you eventually get some piece of nonsense and you treasure it because you've won it. I think that the shooting games, all the rest of it, were very much part of that childhood, not childlike, childhood fascination that he had for the vernacular and with the vernacular. I mean, you expect in the kind of fairground entertainment that he favored something to happen. You pull a lever, you do something, you shoot a thing, something happens. So there's always this sense in his slot machines or whatever, something is about to happen. Where is the invisible lever that will deliver this content to me? And of course the lever is in here.
Flight. That was, I think that was the second film we did, maybe a year later or 6 months later. And that we did in the summer in Bryant Park. And he had this idea of having a young girl who had went to her first ball and danced all night. Like early in the morning, she would be running home and strangely excited. Very Cornell idea.
I stopped in Bryant Park at 3 o'clock for moments of the most profound and satisfying peace and quiet enjoyment of the city that I can remember. iridescent pigeons on the branches of the trees in the sun, against a pattern of the windows of the office buildings, some catching sun's dazzle, the stretch of lawn and fountain, the mellow, almost hazy atmosphere of an Indian summer.
Most of the time, he was really, well, disappointed with the results. And we looked at it a week later. But that time, something happened that really made him happy. There was this little girl, about 10 years old, in a blue dress, and she was just wandering around, like in a dream, and she didn't notice, seem to notice anything. And he sort of nudged me and said, "Get her in the picture." So I started pointing the camera at her, and she never noticed the camera. It was fairly close, and I kept just following her, going back and forth. And that's when he flashed one of his rare smiles.
Joseph was a child, and he demanded the triumph of his own imagination, as children do, to the expense of anything else that anyone might need to be living out in relationship to him. And I feel only in his late 60s did he begin working his way up through adolescence, and it was extraordinarily painful for him.
We met in this cold February 14th on Bryant Square, and nothing looked like anything. So after a while, he said, well, let's warm up and go into this donut shop and have a donut and a coffee. And we were sitting at the front at the counter. So he nudged me and says, "Do you see that girl in the back there? Isn't she beautiful?" So I looked, and there was really a very pretty girl there. And then we left. We went outside. And then Cornell said, "I'd like you to do something for me. Take this package and give it to the owner of the coffee shop and tell him to give it to the girl." And then he had one of his very rare smiles and said, "I'd like to see her face when she opens this up." Later, I found out this was the girl he was really in love with. And at that time, he hadn't even hardly talked to her. He just had seen her. But later he talked to her, and she came out and became kind of assistant in Flushing. And then later things went kind of bad. She stole a few boxes. He got the boxes back anyway, and he forgave her. It turned out she was also a drug addict of some kind and an aspiring young actress. Then there was this strange story that she got killed somewhere on Times Square. Cornell was very upset, obviously, and he arranged for a funeral for her.
The tragedy of Joyce, her Christmas card reaching me after her passing. I am remembering you, blessed Joyce, in a new light. Bus waiting to go. Just now, in Main Street, I have bought a T.S. Eliot book for you and one for Robert, remembering the 2 stars on the western horizon he indicated for me.
The images of people that fascinated him most, of course, were images of women. Famous women, glamorous women. Some of the imagery comes from advertising and comes from popular magazines. His relationship to women, I think, was like his relationship to France. I don't speak out of any deep knowledge, but I think it was probably always a romantic relationship of fantasizing from afar. And so I realized I had become one of these women he fantasized about, and that it didn't have to do with the fact that he had read my first book, this novel, The Benefactor. It had to do with the photograph on the back of the book. And sure enough, one day a collage arrived, brought by a messenger. And then there were invitations to come out, and I didn't want to intrude on him. But when he asked several times in these notes that he would like to be visited by me, he didn't mention David, my son. I agreed to come out, but I took David really as a chaperone because actually none of us had met each other. Many people who have not had some kind of conjugal life, who never marry or never form a spousal relationship, have something childlike about them and something asexual about them. And he did have that. There was something like a child. And you didn't feel his sexuality. You felt his delicacy and his refinement.
That girl you brought yesterday, I heard a noise in the hallway, very early morning, like scampering mice feet. I looked out cautiously round the crack in my bedroom door. That girl, just from the shower, dressed only in pigtails, was crouched down low, peering into the hallway boxes, still dripping and completely absorbed. That girl is still crouched low in half shadow. Sometimes the thread holding together these experiences lost to sight, but it runs through them all. The notion that I am unseeable is a wrong notion. The notion of a recluse gets trotted out by people who should know better.